Hello, I'm Jeff Shrum. I'm going to be talking about a Hebrew conditional data set that I've been working on. It will list information about Hebrew conditionals and especially their illocutionary force. And the purpose of this data set is to be used as an exegetical and translation resource. A little history of the project. Dr. Steve Nicole of KNIL presented a data set in the form of a spreadsheet of New Testament Greek conditionals to the Translation Notes Department at SIL in early this year. The SIL TN team saw the value in having this information to help with the writing of exegetical notes. Since many Old Testament helps are in process, a single source for information on Hebrew conditionals was needed. Randy Groff asked me to begin compiling the information on Hebrew conditionals using Steve Nicole's spreadsheet as a template. Just to review a little bit about conditional basics so that we're all on the same page. Conditionals are constructions of the form if A, then B. The if part is the subordinate clause that specifies the condition that must be met or true. It is called the protasis, or P for short. The then part is the independent clause that specifies the consequence if the condition is met or true. It is called apodosis, or Q for short. Go through some things about types or categories of conditionals. Commonly, conditionals are categorized as real and unreal with several subcategories of each. First, for real, the most common is the standard or content conditionals, two names for the same thing. An example is, if I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the city. There's also the generic or habitual conditional. I haven't found it in the Old Testament yet. There are speech act conditionals. This is probably the most common in the Old Testament. As an example is when Jacob makes this vow, if God will be with me and watch over me during this journey, then he will be my God. They can be directive conditionals. Here's an example of one that Pharaoh said, if the child is a son, kill him. They can be interrogative type, a way to get information. If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you destroy it? And there's also the epistemic type, which gives something, some information about the attitude of the speaker, or it shows a conclusion that they made based on the statement in the P. So here is an example where Joseph tells his brothers, if your words are not true, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. So he makes that conclusion. And in the unreal category, they can be predictive. An example is, if I went up with you for a single moment, I would destroy you, Exodus 33:5. They can be hypothetical. If I find any spotted female goats, then they are yours. They can be counterfactual. If you had not come quickly to meet me, Nabal wouldn't have had any male family members left tomorrow. Or they can be concessive. Even if he is a brave man with the heart of a lion, he will be shaken. Some information about the need for the data. Languages vary on how conditionals can be used. I found some examples in Studies in African Linguistics, Volume 46, number 1 and 2. Some languages can only use conditionals for things that are possible, such as Makere Kotoko from Cameroon. They cannot be used for the past. In some languages, they cannot be used for counterfactuals. In some languages, they cannot be used for concessives. Temporal adverbials and conditionals use the same morphosyntactic structure leading to ambiguity. This is cited about Makere Kotoko, Schwabu, and in Studies in African Linguistics, and from my own data in Takwani. Here's an example of an impossible conditional, Numbers 22:18. If Barak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go against the command of the Lord my God to do anything small or great. So clearly Balak would never do this, and Balaam is using figurative language to make a point. Languages that cannot use conditionals for events that are not possible need to be alerted that this verse is talking about something that's not possible. and then they could consider how to render it without a conditional. Example of past conditionals. Some languages cannot use conditionals that refer to something that has already happened. This is similar to not allowing conditionals for things that are not possible, because in their worldview it is not possible to change the past. So if we look at Numbers 15:24, which says, and if it was done unintentionally without the community's awareness, the entire community is to prepare one young bull for burnt offering as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This could be rendered with a relative clause, such as, and in that case, and I'm sure there are other approaches that could be used, but it does not have to be a conditional. In languages that would not be natural. Examples of counterfactuals in the Bible, Genesis 43:10. If we had not delayed, we could have come back twice by now. Counterfactuals would appear to be attempting to change the past, and this would be nonsense or infelicitous in some languages. Various strategies are possible for rewording counterfactuals. Modals could be used, such as we should not have delayed, or adverbials, such as when we waited so long, or in the time we have been waiting. You can make an explicit statement, such as the easy translation. We must go now. We have already talked for too long. By now we could have gone to Egypt and returned twice. An example of a concessive statement from the Bible, and they are usually easy to find. They have connectors such as even if, although, though, despite. So Job 13:15, even if he kills me, I will hope in him. So we can find some examples where this has been rendered without a concessive conditional. The CEV has, God may kill me, but still I will trust him. And NLT has, God might kill me, but I have no other hope. And another possibility might be, maybe God will kill me, but I will trust in the justice of God, or trust in the justice of God anyway. Some further evidence for need for this data is that many conditional systems vary from the biblical Hebrew. I was a little surprised to find out Swahili has 2 conditional markers that indicate how likely an event is to occur. So Hebrew does not have that structure. Translators would have to be alerted to that and deal with that. Some languages use evidentials and conditionals, and they likewise would need to take that into account when translating conditionals. And I'm sure there's many other structures. That's just a few that I found. So a common way of categorizing conditionals in traditional Hebrew grammars is how possible something is, or the degree of hypotheticality. So let's look at a few verses. Exodus 20:25. If you make a stone altar for me, do not build it of cut stones. I would say that's probable. It's probable they'll make an altar, but not guaranteed. The probability has to do with the P statement. It's not based on the Q statement. Exodus 21:7. Now if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she's not to go free as male slaves do. I listed that as possible. It's possible that a father would sell his daughter, but I would think most did not. And in Genesis 13:16, so if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. So I think that's clearly impossible. So the data set will mark passages with the system. There's also the factual, if it's just stating something that's already happened. And you'll see there's some of that in the data. A little bit more about the need for the data is important. Part of the data will be to list the illocutionary force and emotions of a verse, so because the emotions matter. Knowing the illocutionary force and emotion of a verse is essential for sign language and oral Bible translation. Commentaries don't routinely discuss the illocutionary force of verses. Distinguishing between similar types of statements can be important in translation in some languages. So warnings might be formed differently than a threat. Commands could have a different form than exhortation. Advice could be different than a rebuke. Laws versus a warning, or wishes versus predictions, and many others. So here's my growing list of illocutionary force categories I've been working on. A very plain one is to assert something. So somebody's asserting something as a fact. Similar is a declaration. So a person could declare they believe something. That would also be a speech act. Exhortation, which I would think is different than a command. In some languages, the syntax would be different. Warning versus a threat. So think about Moses warning the people if they don't obey God, what's going to happen. When God tells them the same thing, it's a warning, it's a threat, because he can execute judgment if people don't obey. There are promises in the Bible, so some languages might mark those differently. Oaths and curses, those are quite common in the Old Testament. Many oaths in the Old Testament, while they have the conditional particle, they leave the cue or the consequence implicit, and so they're often not translated as conditionals. And in the data, we put those verses that have the conditional particle, and they are an oath, but they don't have a full conditional syntax. Those are put into a special section called non-conditional uses of the particles. Petitions, requests, polite requests. So in some languages, if you petition a superior, you do that very differently than if you request from an equal or an inferior. And then you might even have a way to make a polite request of an equal or inferior that's different than a normal request. So I want to mark those for those languages where it might make a difference. Some statements are demand. We also have commands and directives. So those can be distinct in some languages. Argue, negotiate, those are similar. Again, there might be a difference. It certainly would help to know how to read a passage out loud if they're arguing or negotiating, though the words would look similar. A wish, some conditionals are used to express a wish. We have questions or interrogatives, simply a conditional to ask for information. Conditionals can be used to express a lament or a complaint or a worry. Those are similar, but they can be different, certainly when the scripture is read aloud. There are a few where conditionals are used to express acquiescence or defeat. If I must, if Benjamin must go to Egypt, if I die, I die. So there are a few. There are some where conditionals are used to mock or scorn. Certainly in the New Testament, when the Pharisees say, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross, it might not be so common in the Old Testament. Predictions are quite common. Conditionals are used for that. And a very special one that I'm using is one I'm calling law. So there are many conditionals that are explaining the law and the case law in the Pentateuch, and they're not referring to specific people doing things. So if it was a certain particular person or group of person, I would just call it a prediction or hypothetical. But it's a very special category in the Old Testament, and I want to mark those differently because they are laws and they're not referring to a specific person. And we may need more categories, but right now those are the ones that I'm using. So an example of illocutionary force, we could look at Genesis 4:7a. If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? So is this a command, a prediction, or an exhortation? And think about how you would translate it differently depending on your decision of the illocutionary force here. Now I want to cover some information about Hebrew conditionals, since it's very important to determine if something is a conditional and what type in Hebrew, and it's fairly complicated. The default Hebrew conditional marker is im. When I searched in Paratext, it said that lemma occurs 1,067 times. The BHRG says it appears 797 times as a subordinating conjunction. So if those numbers are even close, im is frequently not used as a conditional. Bill Bivens, in his article, Building Spaces, Reevaluating the Particle im, he states that im is used in 7 other constructions besides conditionals. So you could see that article for more details. There are other markers in Biblical Hebrew that are used for certain kinds of conditionals, the counterfactuals, the last 2. And then there's some other markers or particles that are sometimes used as for conditionals. So there's key, which is generally that, hin and hinna, which is people debate. It's some kind of discourse thing, marker, look, or traditionally behold. But there are a few verses where VHRG and others list them as having a conditional force. Asher, which is a relative pronoun, it's very common as a relative pronoun, but very rarely it's also used as a conditional marker. And there are 4 conditional constructions without the typical markers. This information is from Peter Schmidt's recent article on Hebrew conditionals in Leviticus. Sometimes a regular Vayikatal sequence has conditional force. Sometimes a relative clause has conditional force. Sometimes using a participle has a conditional force, such as Exodus 21:15. And sometimes an infinitive construct, which can be sort of adverbial. An example is when transgressing, Joshua 23:16. Christopher Samuel has marked some of these constructions in BART, which is another software package for studying biblical languages. He's marked them with a note from the Vandermeer grammar, and I've been consulting that, looking at the Net Bible and other sources to find these constructions with conditional force, but that don't have, but do not have one of the traditional conditional particles. Some challenges in the work. You might have already thought of a few, but here are some. The NIV and other English translations add if as a complementizer sometimes. This is good English style, but does not reflect the Hebrew. Verses that the NIV uses if as a complementizer are placed in a special section called Other Issues in this data set, so that it's there to help non-Hebrew specialists. There are verses where im and lu are not used to form a conditional, and they're placed in a separate section called non-conditional use of im and lu. That's there for completeness. And in many languages, temporal adverbs look the same as conditionals, and the difference between if and when is blurred. The same can be true of Biblical Hebrew. So the dataset will seek to clearly mark clauses as whether they are temporal or some type of conditional. Here is an example of the dataset. It's in a spreadsheet. So we have the NASB for a more literal translation, and NIV 11 or other for a different look at the verse. Then there's a column called P first. So the typical order is P, then Q. And so this is a yes/no column for easy sorting. And you can find the unusual ones that are in the reverse order by looking for ends here. Then there's a column for the verb, the type of verb in the P clause. Then there's a column for the verb or verb construction in the Q clause. Then there is a column, a yes or no column, if the ing particle is used. As we saw, there are other particles that can be used, or sometimes no particle. So it would be a quick way to find all the ones with eam and all the ones without eam. I thought that would be a good feature for the data set. And then there's a column to list all the particles that are being used. Sometimes there's more than one. Then there's a column for real, unreal, so it's R or U for unreal. That's a very common categorization for conditionals, so there's a column for that. And then there's a column for probability, which is shorter and easier to say than hypotheticality. So that can be possible, probable, factual, or impossible. There's no impossibles on the screen, but there are some in the data. Then there's a column for time orientation, future, neutral, where the time is not relevant, present, past. And there's the column for illocutionary force. We went through the list of some of those that are being used here. We can see two exhortations, one that's either a warning or a threat, not quite decided, and then one that's clearly a warning. Then there's a column for type, so it can be generic, it can be a standard or content. So I'm using CNT for the abbreviation for content. Those are very common. There's also SA for speech act. You might see epistemic here, which are rare, but there are a few in the Old Testament. And then there's a notes column where I have some helpful notes. Often they're just taken from the Net Bible. They have some really good notes explaining something about the conditional or why it should be considered conditional even when there's not a particle there. So that's a look at what the data set looks like. It's in process. You can see there is a tab for each of the books. I've already populated all the verses that have the Hebrew lemma eam in it, but there's many other kinds of conditionals, so I'll have to put those in and do the categorization. I think eventually we'll form a team because this is a lot of data to go through. I wanted to get it kind of together and working so that it would be easier for people to join the team to do this work. I know with the Greek data set that Dr. Nicole worked on, he had a team of students at KenIL help fill in the very nice spreadsheet they've made that's similar to this one, but for Greek conditionals. So it's time now to hear any questions that you might have about this data or any comments that you might have about how this is being organized.